We're going to continue with Chapter 2, talking about cultural taxonomies. We talked about the first of these, individualism versus collectivism. We're moving on to the second, high context versus low context cultures or messages. I have to say that in my experience, students sometimes have a little more difficulty in dealing with this dichotomy. I think the distinction between individualism and collectivism seems quite clear and logical and makes a good deal of sense. This may be a little trickier to grasp. Let's start with these assumptions that the author makes about the distinction here between high context and low context. The degree in which interactants, the people involved in a conversation, focus on different contexts, physical, socio-relational, perceptual, while communicating varies considerably from culture to culture. For example, nonverbal communication is more important in some cultures than others. Let's look at an example of that. Two businessmen in Japan greet each other for the first time. What do? Well, the first thing they do is bow. And bowing is not necessarily a simple act in Japan. How low you bow depends on where you are in the hierarchy and where you perceive where the other person is in the hierarchy. So, for example, if you're greeting the president of the company, CEO of a company, versus a manager, the how low you bow might be quite different. The other thing that you probably do when you greet each other is that you will exchange business cards, and there's a very set etiquette to how that happens in Japan. And this encounter involves a lot of nonverbal communication. So you're bowing, you're handing over your business card with two hands, you're bowing as you hand it over. When you get the business card from the other person, you don't just stick it in your pocket. You make a point of looking at it, reading one side, flip it over, read the other side. So there's a whole process there that takes place. And that's what is meant by a high context culture, that there are a lot of things going on there, a lot of things being communicated, not through language, through other means, through an awareness of where the other person is in the social hierarchy, an awareness of what the situation is that you're in, that those aspects of the context are very important in conveying meaning. And that's what is meant by high context. Namely, there are a lot of other things going on in those encounters that give a lot of information, a high level of information, high context. So that's opposed to American context, which is low context, American culture. So if you have two businessmen in the United States who meet each other, what do? Well, say, hi, how you doing? They shake hands very briefly, shaking hands and talking at the same time. There's not a lot of ritual involved there. There's a very brief conversation that takes place. How you doing? What's your name? Blah, blah, blah. And then you get down to the essentials. And in that conversation that follows, what's going on is that there's a lot of very direct communication taking place through language. And this is typical of low context cultures, namely that communication comes above all through words, through language that's being used, and less so through nonverbal language. Certainly there's that's taking place as well in encounters in American society. But in general, in individualistic societies, they tend to be low context. In other words, there's not as much ritual involved. There's not as much nonverbal communication. that's vital to understanding the message that's being sent. Most of what's going on comes through language, through words that are being exchanged, through what's called the explicit code. And what we mean by that is simply the language that's used to exchange ideas. The countries that are considered low context in general tend to be individualistic countries. So they're on the scale of low context cultures. We have the United States, Germany, other Germanic countries, the UK. So there, once again, what we're saying is the words are the primary carriers of meaning. On the other end of the scale, we have collectivistic societies, Asian societies, Latin American. SEA stands for Southeast Asian cultures. ME there on the scale stands for Middle Eastern cultures. And there we're talking about typically high context situations in which words are not always the primary carriers of meaning. There's a lot of other things going on in the conversation. Another way to think about this distinction between low context and high context is that if you think about people who've been married for a long time, well, they can communicate very well without using language. There's a high level of communication taking place, a high context, because they've lived with one another for so long a time that they can tell from facial expressions, from very minor, subtle changes in body language, what a person is feeling or thinking, or how a person is reacting to, for example, a request or a question. That those things can be communicated not necessarily through language, and that's what's meant here by high context. So that's another way to think about that. Let's look at some other distinctions. So what we were saying there about high context is that there are other sources of information for what's going on in conversational encounters, not just language, not just the verbal code. That in high context cultures, a lot of what's being communicated is done in an indirect way and implied and not said directly, as is the case in low context cultures. High context cultures, Asia, for example, in China, Japan, silence is valued. This is true also in Native American culture. Silence has a great deal of importance. In mainstream American culture, if you're having a conversation with somebody at a party and suddenly one of you doesn't say anything for a while, that can be awkward. That's uncomfortable. That doesn't send any kind of message. It's just something to be avoided. And that's quite, we'll get back to this when we talk later about nonverbal communication, but silence has a very important role to play in a number of cultures, and those tend to be high context cultures. In other words, the silence itself sends a message. So examples of high context culture, once again, we're looking at Southeast Asian cultures, a number of African cultures, Western European cultures in general tend to be low context. This is another way of looking at this distinction between low context and high context. If you look on the left-hand side of this graphic, so what we're seeing there is the low context kind of perception of things, which is very narrow. So in a conversation, we're looking at, what are we looking at? Words, gestures, tone of voice. Those are the things that convey the messages. Look on the right-hand side, high context has a broader range of vision there in terms of what's taken into consideration in understanding what's happening in a conversation. So certainly words, gestures, and tone of voice, those are all things that convey meaning. but also what is conveyed through nonverbal communication, through the posture of the person that you're speaking with, through facial expressions, through the through the context of where that conversation takes place. There are lots of things going on in terms of messages sent in high context cultures. Another way that cultures are differentiated is in talking about their value orientations, and here being referred to are the values that people hold, that they have grown up with, that they acquire from the contact with individuals from their culture. These are values that are learned in that way. They're not universal human values. They're not innate. They're not with you when you're born. And these are values that help guide our behavior, our actions, tell us what's right, what's wrong, what we should do, what we should avoid doing. And as always, there's the caveat that people are individuals, that while these may be the default values that we acquire in a particular culture, that we can make decisions that move us in a different direction. If we look at a concrete example of comparing two cultures, the United States is an individualistic, low context culture, whereas China is a collectivistic, high context culture. And in surveys that have been done, what ranks high in terms of values in the United States, what people value, are self-interest, self-reliance, individualism, and also equality, particularly equality of opportunity. If you do a similar survey in China asking people what are the most important values in your society, you get a different set of values at the top, namely respect for elders and tolerance and harmony. And scholars who have worked on this as a way of differentiating cultures have come up with different approaches. One of those that's used quite a bit was done by Condon and Joseph. And what they did was look at 6 different areas and what values are typical in individualistic versus collectivistic cultures in these 6 different areas, starting with the individual. So there, the distinction is between valuing distinctive individualistic behavior versus conformity and cooperation in society, value placed on youth versus old age. In collectivistic societies, typically there is a assigned role for different groups, and that includes the different roles for men and for women. Moving up the scale from the individual to the family, you have the difference between a democratic kind of family model that's open and democratic versus a more hierarchical authoritarian model where typically the father makes all the decisions and where roles are very prescribed. Moving on up to the level of society. In individualistic cultures, you're on your own versus being part of a collective. What's particularly valued are individual rights versus what's good for the group. Different views on human nature. Are people inherently good or bad? Individualistic societies tend to have this view that's inherited from the Enlightenment, that people are good. Is happiness achievable? Well, yes, we think that's true. That's embedded in our Constitution in the United States. Can people change? Well, that varies, whether you think that's possible or not. How nature is viewed can be quite different in different cultures as well. Do we control nature, or does nature control us? How do we understand nature? Does it have rules that we can investigate and understand and control? Or is it something that's organic, and we as human beings are not really superior in any way? We're just part of nature. Different views as well on the supernatural. What's important in cultures? Is it spiritual goals, or is it material goods? Is it possible to understand the cosmos or not? Another way that we can distinguish cultures is this concept of power distance, which refers not to physical personal space, something that we're going to be talking about later on, but rather refers to hierarchies. And in the words of Gerhard Hofstede, who's the one who coined this term, it's the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. So in cultures where there's a large power distance, the idea is that there's a considerable gulf separating those on the bottom of the social ladder from those on the top. Whereas in small power distance cultures, they tend to emphasize equality. So that manifests itself in different ways in the culture. In the family, we're talking about more hierarchical structure in large power distance cultures. In school, large power distance cultures place the teacher up on a pedestal. The teacher is always right. In a work environment, there are very fixed roles that are very different. In large power distance cultures, the worker has an assigned role, and it's not to make decisions or to offer suggestions on how the company should be run. Here's some other ways to think about this distinction. In low power small power distance cultures, they emphasize equality, emphasize the role of the individual. Things tend to be symmetrical, that is to say, people are treated the same way, regardless of their role, their place in the hierarchy. They tend to be informal, tend to value ideas, suggestions from subordinates. Quite different values there in a power distance culture, where seniority, age, rank, title are very important, and what that means also is there's an unequal, asymmetrical kind of interaction among members of a culture that has a high power distance. More emphasis on formality, and subordinates are expected to do their work and not contribute ideas. In talking about power distance, one of the terms that's often used there is the distinction between positional power and earned power. The idea with earned power is you have, for example, in American society, you might have a good deal of power and influence, but it's not because of who you are, or, for example, what family you were born into, or what group you belong to, but it's because you've worked your way up the ladder. Whereas in large power distance cultures, you hold power maybe because of other factors. It may not be that you worked your way up. It's maybe because of family relationship, for example. There's a difference there also in how authorities are viewed, whether they're viewed with some skepticism or whether they're accepted as in large power cultures as part of the hierarchy. This term face work has nothing to do with Facebook, but this is something we'll be talking about a little bit more later on in the course. the concept of dignity or respect, with concepts and that that plays out as self-face. In other words, the desire to maintain one's own dignity. Other face, a respect for the image of the other person that one is interacting with, or mutual face, the idea that we should be concerned with maintaining our own image and that of the of our conversation partner as well. One of the things that's interesting in terms of power distance is the body language, and there are some interesting distinctions, namely whether you have eye contact. Kind of varies according to the culture, and kind of lines up with power distance. So if there's a high power distance, you tend to show more respect by not having eye contact, particularly with superiors. Whether you smile or not can be related as well to power distance. And the last cultural taxonomy that we're going to be talking about in this chapter, something called uncertainty avoidance. This refers to the extent to which members of a culture feel threatened by uncertain or unknown situation, and the extent to which they try to avoid those situations. And so there we have this distinction between weak uncertainty avoidance cultures, in other words, where it's not very important to avoid uncertainty, and strong uncertainty avoidance cultures, in other words, where they want to avoid the unknown or uncertain. And what's typical of weak uncertainty avoidance cultures is that, in fact, uncertainty is not seen as something necessarily negative, sometimes something that's embraced. Typically, in those kinds of cultures, people will not stay in the job for their entire lives. They're be likely to not only change jobs, but even change careers, and that's not seen as necessarily a negative thing. Risk-taking is encouraged. Conflict is not always something to be avoided. Innovations are welcomed and expected. On the other hand, strong uncertainty avoidance cultures, these tend to be Eastern cultures in general. Uncertainty is regarded as something negative. People want to stay in the same, not only the same career, but very often the same job, the same company for their entire work lives. They expect things to be laid out very clearly, and don't expect things to change very often. Status quo is appreciated. Conflict is minimalized. Consequences of uncertainty avoidance. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, such as Asian cultures, they tend to be more worried about the future, have a high level of anxiety, tend to be somewhat resistant to change, and uncertainties in life are something to be avoided and overcome. Members of low uncertainty avoidance cultures, and that would be, for example, the United States, they tend to have a shorter range view of things, more willing to embrace change, see competition, see conflict as something that are inherent and natural in human interactions. They accept dissenting opinions, and individual achievement is something that's valued and beneficial. And that will be the end of Chapter 2.